Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com webinar. We're excited that you've joined us. We have a great topic, a New Year's ransomware resolution. We all need resolutions, but how about that ransomware? We have a really good panel of speakers today I'm excited to introduce to you. Our webinar is being sponsored by Axio. My name is Mitch Ashley. I'll serve as your host and moderator. A few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, so sit back, relax. You can take it all in. Listen to our speakers today. We have a really great demo planned and set up. You can also go back and check out the recording later because we are recording it, and we'll be sending the slides to everyone. So all participants will get an email with a link to the slides as well as the recording. We also encourage questions from our audience. I know our speakers really love to entertain questions, hear your thoughts, and engaging with our speakers. So be sure to use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar software. So let's move on to our topic, New Year's ransomware resolution. My pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. First is Dave White, who is president of Axio, and we have Garen Pace, who's cyber product leader with AIG. Let's get right to our topic, gentlemen. I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Mitch. And thank you, Security Boulevard, and thank you for everyone who has joined us today. As we begin the new year, it's natural to ask the question of what changes we need to make. And as cybersecurity professionals, we're always asking that question in response to changes in the threat landscape. And one of the major threat expansions that we've witnessed over the past couple of years has been ransomware. The pace, scale, and prevalence of ransomware has continued to increase. So that's the topic today. As we begin this new year, let's take a fresh look at ransomware and what we can do about it. So we're going to cover these topics today. We'll start with a really high-level review of ransomware trends. We're going to briefly talk about the privileged visibility that cyber insurers have, and my good friend Garen Pace, who has joined us today, the kind of data that he has access to and will share with us. Ransomware has evolved. We're going to talk about the evolved ransomware attack pattern and how ransomware, using that attack pattern, ransomware attackers are demanding higher and higher ransoms. We'll wrap that up with talking about the top 3 things you should do right now, and that's backed by the data that Garen has access to, given his privileged visibility. And we'll wrap up with a ransomware preparedness assessment that Axio is releasing today. We're making that available to all subscribers in our Axio360 platform. We're also making it available as part of our free tool. I'll give a very brief demo of that toward the end and tell you how you can get signed up. So with that, let's move on to some introductions. I'm David White. I'm the co-founder and president at Axio. I've been working in the cybersecurity world for about 20 years now and have architected and authored a number of methods, models, and frameworks over the years. I've been working with Garen Pace for about 5 years now. Garen is incredibly knowledgeable of cybersecurity, and Garen likes to joke that AIG has invested millions in his cybersecurity education. So Garen, tell us a little about your background.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, I've been working at AIG for 15 years now. I've been very fortunate. I started as a line underwriter, underwriting professional liability insurance and a little thing that at the time we called cyber insurance, this newfangled product. So I've been very fortunate to be in this space. That joke goes to the idea that, obviously cyber insurance is a growing market. We've seen lots of claims paid out. Every one of those is an opportunity to learn. And that's what Dave's going to talk about, what insurance can bring to the table and hopefully improve best practices and elevate everyone's game. So my job at AIG, I'm part of a global team that makes sure that AIG underwriters are underwriting cyber risk correctly wherever it exists in an AIG insurance contract, and we bring the right tools to the job, the right pricing, the right thinking. So pleased to be here to join Axio to talk about ransomware and what we can do to stop it. It definitely is a plague that needs addressing. So really pleased to talk to you all.
Thanks, Garen, and thank you for, you've put a lot of time into preparing for this with me, and I really appreciate your generosity and sharing some of your data and insights with me and with the audience today. So let's start by taking just a very quick look at some ransomware statistics. Ransomware continues to rise as one of the top cyber threats impacting companies worldwide. You see that first stat there, the year-over-year increase in ransomware attacks in the US. So we've seen more than a doubling of attacks from Q3 2019 to Q3 2020. Garen, can you comment on this second stat about ransomware now including data exfiltration?
Sure. So, while we've seen, as Dave mentioned, the evolution of ransomware over the past couple of years, and we'll talk more about, how it's being deployed in a little bit more strategic sense by the attackers. But one of the more recent trends that we've seen started in the beginning of 2020, really, is not only the encryption of files and the ransoming back of the availability of the network, but also exfiltrating data. So to increase the amount of leverage they have and to get the victims to, in their eyes, hopefully, pay their demands. They are not only ransoming back the decryption key, but they are also exfiltrating the data and then threatening to publish it. They're extorting victims as well. That's unfortunately a trend that has started in 2020 and seems to be accelerating. So you should be aware that not only is ransomware a big threat to availability, interruption, but all the risks that come attendant with data breaches also come into play increasingly. Whether it's liability, reputation damage, regulatory risks, unfortunately, really piling it on.
And then, so these events are getting a lot more complex as you pull in all of those data breach impacts in addition to the ransomware recovery impacts. Talk about what's happening with ransom payments. And we're going to see some of your data in a little while, but we see this stat from Coveware.
So yeah, sorry. And we'll talk more in a few slides about what it means, how we've seen this evolution of ransomware from something that was largely trying to lock up a single computer to something that is targeting the entire network, really. But we've seen attackers play a little bit more of a long game and find and disable backups and really try and find out where the critical data is. And we've seen them scale their demands along with that effort. So we've certainly seen significant increases in ransoms. Some of them we'll talk in a little bit are unfortunately millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. It's a big deal. It is a plague on business, I think, I've said it before, and we really need to be addressed.
What's that old car ad? This is not your father's ransomware.
Yes, this is not your father's ransomware. We were joking earlier, Dave and I. Ransomware the demands used to be in the hundreds of dollars, and the biggest loss was, maybe some pictures or some documents on your personal computer. Now these attacks, unfortunately, are crippling networks. They're stopping production of whatever a company is producing, stopping the flow of information. They are very significant incidents.
Great. So I'd like to just talk for a few minutes about the privileged visibility and role that cyber insurers have, and why insurance matters to cybersecurity leaders. So, cyber insurers are some of the only organizations that have data on the cybersecurity posture of an organization before an event and detailed insights into what happened during an event and how the event occurred. So they're one of the few places in the world where we can really look for real data on the effectiveness of controls. And this wasn't cyber insurers, but in the last century, the insurance industry was credited with solving the boiler safety problem by driving safety and engineering standards to solve that risk. And that's an example of what I like to call the promise of insurance, where by aggregating all of this data on the before event posture of an organization and what happened during an event that caused the organization a loss, the industry has an enormous capability for driving change in the industry. When in the cybersecurity world, when I first met Garen about 5 years ago, he was busily working on what then was a problem that we were all reading about in the news, and some of us fighting, which was the point of sale intrusions. And I think that, you know, the insurance industry did make a difference with point of sale intrusions. Garen, can you tell us about that, and then what insurance is doing today to proactively address ransomware?
Sure. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so believe it or not, cyber insurance has been around for 20 years now. A few years ago was probably one of, you know, its first big tests when we saw those large point of sale intrusions. You know, I think it was kind of the height of stealing credit cards and criminals reselling them for profit. And as you know, the cyber insurance market was growing year after year and year, and this is our first big test. This threat had kind of grown to its maturity. You know, there was a significant problem in the market. You know, there was a significant problem in security. A lot of these big point of sale intrusions and lots of credit cards being stolen. So I'm pleased to say that at the time, insurers responded how we want insurance in general to operate. They looked at the problem and said, we see these losses. This is why this is how they're unfolding. These are the best practices that we believe will reduce the risk, and they provided incentives to implement them. And you saw folks who were in the cyber insurance market, you know, being educated about that, you know, say, hey, we believe this is the best in class solution. It didn't mean you had to get it to get insurance, but you would pay less if you adopted those practices that were proven to reduce risk. And at the time, it was with end-to-end encryption of credit cards to prevent, even in the instance of a data breach or into the company, you know, the loss of those credit cards. So in terms of ransomware, we are very fortunate. I am very fortunate to be in this position where, unfortunately, we see bad things happening, but we want to educate and we want to push those controls which we think have the best return on investment, to again help educate our customers and to reduce the risk of ransomware.
And Garen, you've been very generous in sharing some AIG data with us for today. So let's take a look at the first of 2 pages of data. Tell us what we see here on the left.
Sure. What I hope you see here on the left really just illustrates that, you know, ransomware is an increasing, as Dave mentioned, an increasing threat. For the past couple of years now, it has seen no slowdown in its pace. I should mention that, of course, the cyber insurance market has been growing. So the more policies you write, the more claims you're going to see. I can tell you, if you look at these graphs, these bars here on the left, the cyber insurance market has not been growing that much. And you're looking at that last stat there for the 6 months of 2020, the 6 months of 2020 already being 3/4 of 2019. That's some steady growth. You know, I want to be cautious. Unfortunately, you know, fortunately and unfortunately, but AIG is a publicly traded company. I can't yet comment on Q4, but I think that these stats show that certainly through Q3 of 2020, ransomware has only continued to grow in frequency. In our data, I think that matches the greater, you know, the greater threat suite that companies see. Of course, we all read about it in the news, and it continues to impact not just the cyber insurance market, but business at large.
And on the right, we see that it's also the claims seem to be increasing in scale as well. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes, exactly. So what we're trying to show here is that you know, over the past couple of years, you know, cyber insurance covers all manner of things. We're not here to talk about that, but what we are here to talk about is how ransomware has increased its market share on the biggest losses that we see. And I think that's a direct result of the frequency and severity of ransomware only increasing. There's a little bit of a caveat here. You know, insurers, we have to deal with development, so sometimes it takes time for claims to mature and for us to see the final cost of an incident. It's the reason we don't have early 2020 data to show you. But I think that there is enough here for you to see that ransomware is becoming a bigger and bigger, and probably now the lion's share of what is driving the cyber insurance market in terms of severity. So not only are these claims frequent, but severe.
So things like data breaches tend to develop more slowly, so that it takes much longer for you to see the total amount of the event.
Right. For any any liability to come through in the form of banks taking action, victims filing shareholder suits. Sometimes data breaches take a long time to unfold. Ransomware is relatively very, very fast developing. A lot of the costs of ransomware impact an organization immediately, and that also translates into cyber insurers being impacted very quickly.
Got it. And so I know AIG is one of the world's largest cyber insurers. Can you just say a few words about the type of companies that you insure, so that we understand what this data represents from a market perspective?
Sure. AIG is a global insurer. Our cyber insurance book is also global. It skews a little bit towards North America. Cyber insurance was marketed first and probably is most heavily penetrated in North America. But lately there's been a lot of growth in Europe. We have a significant presence in Europe and in Asia Pac, and even in South America. So it is truly a global look. In terms of size, AIG writes small companies all the way up to Fortune 1000 companies. So I think it is a pretty good representation of the entire profile of companies doing business. I will say we compared to some other insurers, we probably skew a little bit towards the bigger side. There are some insurers out there who write more a higher number of smaller companies. But I think it is a good, probably one of the most fair looking at the entire scope of business.
Got it. So let's look at the data, page 2. What does this data tell us?
So on the left here, what we're really trying to, as the bullet point speaks to, is that ransomware affects everyone. Again, a couple years ago when we saw those large, point of sale intrusions, there were a couple industries that were really more heavily pressured by that threat. And even in the recent past, we saw a lot of, data breaches in general were something that companies who had a lot of PHI or a lot of credit cards were really more concerned about. Where, we haven't seen that. I mean, we, as insurers, we want to make sure that we price for the risk appropriately. And as we look across the spectrum of our insureds who have had claims, ransomware seems to be pretty equal opportunity. No sector or geography is immune, and that's what we're trying to show there on the left.
And
on the right,
yeah,
I'm sorry, Dave, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you, what about the right?
On the right, couple of things. We just wanted to show the movement in ransom demand. So on the right there, all 4 of these bar charts are supposed to show us how they shift there. So on the right, we've seen the ransom demand over the past couple of years be, back at the kind of the your father's ransomware, I guess we were joking around. We saw small ransoms, almost under $1,000. And lately we've seen ransoms approaching, into the tens of millions of dollars. And this is 2016 to 2020, as the bullet point says. I mean, if we were to look at, 2020, we're seeing average demand in the millions of dollars. The second and third ones on the right here, the average response cost breach counsel and incident response. Incident response first, then breach counsel. To be fair, this is for all incidents. That said, the vast majority of what these firms are responding to are ransomware these days. So I think it is reflective of ransomware, and it just shows the typical cost. And we talked earlier about how a lot of these ransomware incidents now include data exfiltration, which obviously puts a little bit more pressure on the breach counsel side to deal with all the regulatory components. And then the last one is what our data sees, the average amount of interruption over the past couple of years. And unfortunately, it correlates with these attackers are being more strategic. They're not deploying ransomware immediately, sending emails, spray and pray. These attackers are taking their time to get into victims' environments, into their networks, find where the backups are, do reconnaissance, and then truly disrupt a business's ability to run its business, whatever that is, causing significant disruption.
Garen, I've always thought about breach counsel, those outside attorneys that you bring in to help you deal with a data breach, as being sort of the folks that companies would engage if they have data exfiltration. And I know that data exfiltration is increasingly a part of ransomware because of what you said earlier and the data we've seen. Are you suggesting that anyone who suffers a ransomware event should consider engaging outside counsel to help them through that event?
So I believe that companies generally should, and let me tell you why. Our claims professionals are better suited to give this guidance, but more and more regulation is getting involved with understanding the full range of cyber incidents going beyond just data breaches and how they might impact us. So there, because there is a data exfiltration component, because of potential liability, I think there are a lot of reasons that if I were the owner of a business who suffered a ransomware event, I would definitely be using breach counsel to understand my obligations, to make sure that some of the parts of the incident that should be privileged, some of the advice that I'm given about the incident that should be privileged remain within the four walls of the organization. I think those are all important things to do.
Got it. And another thing that really shocked me about this data was that maximum business interruption length of 90 days. I mean, I think that, a lot of companies I've talked to are really optimistic that they could recover from an event like this in a few days. Seeing the average of 10 and the max of 90 makes me concerned that the data isn't bearing that true. Yeah.
So there's a few interesting points on this, and I know we have a lot of content to get to, so I'm going to try and go through them pretty quickly. One, I think a lot of companies in the face of ransomware were just saying our recovery strategy wasn't meant to deal with this. I was prepared to, if the western half of the United States fell off the map, I had 2 data centers, and I was prepared to do an east-west or west-east recovery. And the first time they saw their entire network locked up by ransomware, we didn't architect to deal with this. I also think you need to reach containment before you can even start recovery. And these attackers, the term sophisticated attackers is a little bit overused. But some of these attackers, these organized criminals deploying ransomware, they are very skilled, and achieving containment first before you can start recovery often takes time. So that 90 days, I believe that is reflective of not a solid interruption, but intermittent degradation in that specific example that we're aware of. But nevertheless, these incidents are having material impact on companies for more than they were prepared, more than they thought they allowed in their risk assessment. And we see that in the news, right? So I think if there's one takeaway, that companies should really be taking a good look at their recovery strategy and how it lines up next to the realities of today's big game hunting ransomware.
Got it. Great. Two great recommendations out of the data we see. Let's move on to this the evolved attack pattern here. A lot of people are calling this big game hunting ransomware. What can you tell us about that term? Where did that come from? This is the ransomware that's bringing a lot of companies to their knees. So what's in that term?
Sure. So I think CrowdStrike used this the first time I saw it. CrowdStrike used the term. You might hear others call it interactive ransomware, human-operated ransomware. What we're really talking about is what we had mentioned earlier, is that, you know, in contrast to how ransomware was deployed 3-4 years ago, attackers, you know, kind of put it as an attachment in an email and sprayed it out as spam. And, you know, they hoped that a few people were, you know, unfortunately clicked on it and they got a few small ransoms. Attackers are now going after big game. They're going after the entire network. And where they are getting someone to click on a link, where they are using phishing as an entry point into the organization, their first thought is not deploy ransomware. It is to play a little bit more of a long game, escalate privileges, move laterally, do some reconnaissance, find the data, and then go after deploying ransomware, not to a single computer, but to you know, as much of the network as they can, you know, where you know, as many of the production servers as they can. So I think that's the origin of the term big game hunting, and I think it adequately describes the type of strategy that these actors are deploying when they deploy ransomware.
So we list 4 initial compromise points here, and these are consistent with what we've seen from a number of sources. Coveware has data that they report on these 4 initial compromise points. Can you comment on whether this aligns with what you've seen in your data?
Sure. I think it's pretty close. Perhaps because we skew a little bit more towards the bigger side, which I mentioned earlier. We actually see a little less RDP compromise in our data, in more phishing as the initial entry point. But I think that's just because of our different view, a little bit of a different profile. Coveware certainly has a lot of data. They are doing a lot of work in this space, and I think that any company who is thinking about ransomware and their resilience, as I hope our audience is, should be looking at all 3 of these entry methods, and we can talk about what other includes seriously, because, you know, there are multiple avenues that attackers are using, and I think to truly be safe, we need to, you know, we'll never stop all of these, but we want to certainly reduce the amount that's coming into the top of the funnel, and that the team has to kill later in the kill chain.
Got it. And so, just a quick question on the network edge vulnerability. Are you seeing misconfiguration errors in network facing equipment, or are these patchable software defects that are patchable that are going unpatched for some period of time?
Sure. What we've seen is attackers exploiting true vulnerabilities. You know, software defects that have been reported to the manufacturers. A patch has been available, and unfortunately, companies either, you know, didn't prioritize patching, you know, in hindsight as much as they should have, or, you know, where they were patching, unfortunately, their coverage wasn't what it should have been. I don't mean to trivialize patching. It is a tough thing, especially when you're talking about large numbers of devices, all the complications that exist. You know, but we definitely saw one of the bigger trends that we saw was attackers going after some of those known vulnerabilities in network appliances that were announced in the past. You know, a lot of 2019, 2020 had a lot of these you know, VPNs, load balancers, etc. A lot of vulnerabilities in those remote access solutions, and the attackers took the time to scan the internet, find those victims, and then exploit them. It's really a great avenue for ransomware attackers, because it not only a toehold into the victim's network, you know, an avenue in, but a lot of times they'll find a lot of credentials in those network appliances, particularly if you're talking about, you know, a VPN.
Got it. So once they get in, what are they doing?
So what we see is, again, attackers are taking a little bit more of a long-term view, and I'm going to use that. Let me qualify that. Oftentimes, these attacks can unfold very quickly. I mean, usually a matter of days, maybe a little longer weeks, but we've seen them as short as a few hours. I'm talking, when I say they take a little bit more time, I'm saying in contrast to a few years ago when an attacker may have just sent out thousands of phishing emails with a ransomware payload. Here, the attacker is trying to get in and remain stealthy. The first time they get someone to click on a link, they're trying to escalate privilege, move laterally in the environment, take their time to find out where everything is, and their ultimate goal really is to get domain admin privileges. In the vast majority, I'm going to say the vast majority of times, I'm aware of one exception in my personal, my specific knowledge, but they're after this domain administrator. They want to take those, compromise those credentials, which allow them to deploy their ransomware literally across the domain and impact, all of the computers in the domain.
Yeah, so you can't say all the time they're doing this because you have seen one exception. Yeah,
I've seen one exception among dozens,
okay.
but it was a little bit of an oddity. So I do. We'll get into in a bit, what we think companies should be doing about this, but certainly protecting those privileged credentials is high on that list.
And then we see what they do once they've secured domain admin credentials. We see this sort of triple threat of actions. How often do we see all three of these things?
Lately, it's becoming more common than not.
Okay.
Unfortunately, a lot of the ransomware groups that are out there have moved towards exfiltrating data and setting up these so-called data leak sites. So we had always seen them obviously deploying their ransomware. Destroy backups, just to be clear, a lot of ransomware itself will destroy shadow copies. That process happens. The ransomware does it as the ransomware is running. It's a little bit automatic. But we've also seen the attackers kind of hands-on keyboard say there are, they've endeavored to make sure that when they deploy the ransomware, they get the backup servers too. And if for some reason the backup server, is maybe a Linux system, not a Windows system, they will actually go in and delete backups to make sure that the ransomware, puts the company in a position where they have to pay to get their data back. And then, of course, they are exfiltrating data in the majority, we said earlier, 50% of the time recently.
Got it. And so obviously this allows as we saw earlier, it allows a dramatic increase in ransomware payment, and targeting allows the ransomware attackers to go after those companies that might be willing to pay those huge ransoms. And so you shared your top 3 recommendations with me, and let's share them with the listeners here today. Talk me through these.
Sure thing. And I apologize, Dave. There we go. The slide just turned over for me. So the first one is protecting privileged credentials. As we said, in almost every case, attackers are getting domain admin and then using that to push their ransomware to all the Windows computers in the domain, really targeting production servers, but also going after workstations. From our point of view, if you can protect those privileged credentials, then we can hopefully kill the chain at this. There's no way around it. I mean, they want that credential so they can deploy their ransomware widely. So we want to break that chain, and we think that multi-factor authentication is a strong control there. If done right, it really can break that domain. We mentioned down here, scrutinize domain admin privileges and really look at service accounts. Unfortunately, I don't think you can put MFA on service accounts, and we've seen a lot of companies who may have locked down, the credentials used by their domain administrators, but then they had service accounts which are probably overprivileged. They didn't, they weren't compliant with the least privilege principle, and that was another route that attackers were able to use to get domain admin and deploy that ransomware. The second and third, wanted to hit on, endpoint protections. A lot of these attackers they're not bringing, 0 days or what have you. They are using they're using some tried and true tactics, but they are smart enough or sophisticated enough, I think is a better word. They are sophisticated enough to make sure that whatever they are bringing, it might be a known technique, but they're going to put enough of a spin on it that it doesn't appear in, any list of signatures, any reputational source. So, companies need endpoint security protections that are able to detect a bad behavior without relying on any type of reputation source that says, oh, we've seen this attack, we've seen this attack before, we've seen this file before, we've seen this technique before. These attackers are pulling down ransoms in the millions of dollars. They're bringing tools that don't appear on a reputation source. So, the most recent endpoint security platforms seem to be able to deal with this. They are used to clean up these incidents, but unfortunately, a lot of companies are still relying on, it seems like, on legacy endpoint platforms and aren't getting the job done. And then finally, improving vulnerability management. Little bit, it's not sexy, but it's been said for a while. But when attackers continue to be able to, take a critical vulnerability, which has been patched, and a patch has been available for several months, and exploit an externally accessible device in a victim's network, and on top of that device has privileged credentials inside it, it's making it too easy. So while I know that patching isn't trivial, we want to, it is something that we should continue to call out and to make sure, particularly in those critical systems, which have remote access and have credentials in them.
Thank you. It seems like this, the service account issue, just briefly, that's going to be a hard one for organizations to do, right? I mean, if you've got a lot of endpoint solutions out there that are deployed using service accounts, that might take some time for organizations to address. Is that what you're hearing from your clients?
Yes, it is true. So I'm just going to round this out a little bit. A lot of services that an organization might use, whether it's a backup solution, some type of asset management solution. It might have a vulnerability scanner. It might they might have a service account component, which they use to log into other computers on the network and perform the service. It is more work to go through and in accordance with the privilege of least principle, say what specific rights does this service need for it to work. It is more work. Unfortunately, while just giving it domain admin may make it easy to work. Unfortunately, if an attacker takes over that account, that increases the risk. So I think that, I'm not trying to call out companies, and we're all in this security journey together. But I would hope that companies recognize, while it might, when vendors give their implementation guidance to companies, I would hope they realize that it may take a little bit more work to give a service account only the entitlements it needs. But I think it is necessary to, for security reasons to do so. And it's one of the things that attackers are using to deploy ransomware. So it needs to be addressed.
Got it. Great. So Axio was very pleased today to announce our ransomware preparedness assessment. Some of our experts at Axio have worked on this over the past month or so, and have combined a lot of data sources, including a number of interviews. I would say maybe a lot of discussions with Garen Pace to leverage what he's seen in the claims. We've organized the assessment into 3 goals: prevent, contain, and restore. Those goals are supported by 8 control objectives, 4 of them under prevent and 2 each under contain and restore. And then there's a total of 75 controls that align to those control objectives. Now, many of these controls are things that you will be familiar with. Ransomware is not the only reason to do them, but they are particularly important for ransomware. The ransomware preparedness assessment is available in our Axio360 platform and our free tool. So for those of you who are interested in accessing first of all, the free tool, just go to our website, axio.com, and you can sign up for the free tool right there on our homepage. For existing users of our platform, you have, looks like I've locked myself out. Give me a second while I get logged in here. So for existing users, just log in as you normally would. And when you first log into the platform, as many of you are familiar, you will first go to your assessment home screen. Now, some of the features here you may not see on the free tool and may vary based on your license, but for anyone with access to the assessment module, you'll see a new ransomware assessment here at the bottom of the screen. You can launch that assessment. I'll just call this a demo as the name, and then that takes you directly into the assessment interface. You'll see a navigation bar here at the left where you can navigate at the sort of outline level. You see there prevent, contain, restore, and then you can also navigate here across the top by goal. To answer these questions, we have a 4-point answer scale. Fully implemented means that's like your 95 to 100% answer. Largely implemented is like your 80 to 90% answer. Partially is less than 50. I usually think of that as the 20% answer. And then not implemented means we're not doing it. To answer the control, to rate yourself, you simply click on the answer. You can hold down the shift key and click to select a target. We highly recommend that you select a target. That'll help in planning your improvements based on this assessment. And then, of course, you can capture action items, notes, and evidence here on the right-hand tabs. If we go back to the dashboard for a completed ransomware assessment, I haven't created a milestone for this one yet, but you see the top level score out of 1,000 points with a milestone here, your current score, and your target score. So you can see from this sample that I'm currently at a 671, and I've set a target for 869. We recommend setting a target based on a specific time period, like what do you want to get done in the next 12 months or 24 months. You can see the summary here on a percent scale according to those control objectives. And then this widget score comparison shows score comparison now. That's your current score in blue and your target score in green. As soon as we have enough data, we will publish benchmarks here for both current and target. So keep checking back if you complete one of these assessments for the benchmark data. Now I know that was a fast-paced demo, but let's go back to the presentation. Just in summary, you can sign up for the free tool if you're not a subscriber at axio.com. If you are a subscriber and you have access to the assessment module, you'll see the ransomware preparedness assessment there. We're making this available to everyone as part of our efforts to help companies prepare for and better protect themselves from this ransomware issue that we see affecting so many companies today. And if you have any difficulty signing up, accessing, or using the assessment, please reach out to us at support@axio.com.
Dave, I did want to mention that we've worked together a lot to worry about this problem of ransomware, and that we may have a slightly different thinking on it. I think we're very close together, but AIG will accept the Axio ransomware assessment. That's one of the things that we are, looking for. Have recently changed our underwriting standards on, but we've worked with Axio to make sure all the data is there. So that is another reason that if you are an Axio customer, that can also aid you in getting a cyber insurance quote. So happy to say, happy to team up to hopefully educate everyone, customers and applicants alike, and to make things a little bit easier to get an insurance quote.
Thank you, Garen. That's great news, and thanks for sharing with us. That's fantastic. So let's move into Q&A. Mitch, will you come back and let us know what kind of questions we have?
Yeah, happy to. We've got some great questions lined up here. So let's jump right in. First one is, what's your outlook? Does this continue to worsen before it gets better? Will it ever get better? I think this is the question of the ages, right? When it comes to ransomware. Who'd like to take?
What do you? I'd love your perspective on that, Garen. Why don't you take that?
Yeah. I think I'm an optimist by nature, but unfortunately, I think what I see suggests that it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. The trend and the frequency that we've seen and the severity has only gone up. In fact, I don't have hard numbers on this, so this is an empirical observation. But since that data exfiltration component came into play, we've also seen, it seems like more people, unfortunately, having to pay the extortion demand, which is, only validates the criminals' business model. I think that ransomware, cyber in general, including ransomware, is a manageable risk. I want to be clear. It is, let's not be defeatist. So I think that there are, using the controls that we mentioned in smart risk assessment, I think that we can turn this tide. We will. However, I think that in the short term, it will probably get worse before it gets better. Dave?
I agree with you. I mean, I think that, clearly the attackers are making a lot of money on it. If you read the threat profiles and threat research, you see that it's really easy to stand up a ransomware business, if you will, using ransomware as a service, tools, and things like that. So I think that it's going to continue to get worse before it gets better. But I also believe in the promise of the data that you and other insurers have to help drive the change that will help stem this tide. So I do think it will get better.
Great. Let's go to our next question. What types of claims are in the all other buckets?
Yeah, so I apologize. I think as we were talking about the initial entry methods that I think the Cobra data suggested that are used by attackers to get initial access and then subsequently deploy ransomware. We talked about RDP, whether that's brute forcing it or I believe just brute forcing RDP. We talked about phishing, and we talked about external software vulnerabilities, and there was an all other category. Off the top of my head, I don't know what the Cobra data was specifically suggesting, but from our point of view, the things that I would say would probably round this out are, call it a supply chain attack, if you will, third party. Unfortunately, some of these attackers are actually going after MSPs or other people who have access to a lot of other victims' environments. So maybe possibly through no fault of your own, the attacker can attack the supply chain and come at your network. The other one that I would say falls into that bucket would be the use of kind of, I'm going to call them commodity botnets, but a lot of ransomware attackers are buying access through access brokers into victims' networks. So where you may have seen malware in the past, which operated more as kind of a remote access kind of a password stealer, the Emotets and TrickBots of the world, attackers are using those to gain entry into environments. So I would think that falls in that all other bucket in the Cobra data.
Very good, very good. Next question is, what do you think the next evolution in ransomware will be? And where's it headed?
So I think in the short term, I think unfortunately the success that ransomware actors have had with exfiltrating data may lead them to move, even more towards this attack of exfiltrating data and then extorting companies. The encryption, may or may not still factor into their plan, but from my observation, it seems like they've gotten a lot of mileage out of that tactic, and the things that work, they increase. So I am worried about attacks that only try and exfiltrate more data and put companies in tougher positions. So that's my immediate data exfiltration only continuing to build. Dave, do you have a different outlook?
No, I agree with you. I think the data exfiltration is making these much more complex events, and as you and I have discussed many times, those once the data is gone, you have to treat it as though it's going to be disclosed from your data breach disclosure laws that may apply to you in your state or your country. And so I think that's a trend that we're going to see continue to rise.
Good. We've got a really interesting question here about backups. I'm curious why backups are not among the top three, not mentioned much at all. I know you did reference it in your presentation, but if you have good backups, can you ignore ransomware? Say some more about that, Dave. You want to take that?
Well, I think one of the problems here that we're seeing in the big game hunting pattern is that the attackers are able to get. We see in the large predominance of the cases that Garen has reviewed here, that the attackers are able to get the domain admin credentials. And with those credentials, it's with a little work, it's easy. If you've got network connected backups and the access to those backups is controlled by Active Directory, then the attackers have a way to interfere with those backups. And so we haven't seen any hard stats on the number of cases where backups are actually destroyed as part of the attack, but I think that's why we focused on protecting the Active Directory and domain admin credentials over backups, because many organizations have network connected backups that are credentialed through Active Directory. Garen, is that?
No, I think that's totally fair. Yeah, unfortunately, domain joined backups often are themselves the victim of the one of the assets that is locked up in the ransomware attack. So, you need to make sure you have viable backups to recover from. The other thing I would say is that, it certainly helps if your organization, is the victim of ransomware. I applaud you if you are able to back up and not have to pay the attackers for a decryption key. We need to raise the cost to the attackers. That said, we think it is possible not to give up all that ground, right? Saying I'm just going to recover. Well, you still lost whatever your recovery, however long it takes you to recover. There's still half of the time a data exfiltration component, so backups don't save you from potential legal liability from disclosing sensitive data, regulatory risk. So again, we think this is a manageable risk, and we were really pushing on the control areas we think that will help stop ransomware. Sometime in that kill chain between when they initially get access to the environment, but before they get domain admin and the ability to deploy ransomware across the environment. Hopefully, we detect and contain that. We're never going to get the click rate to zero. You're never going to stop all phishing. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but that's why that was our ration. That was at least my rationale in that advice.
And look, Mitch, we also we could have talked for hours and talked through all 65 of the controls that we selected in the ransomware preparedness assessment. We picked Garen and I the top three based on his data that he thinks will make the biggest difference, and decided to focus on those as a way to prioritize those for everyone's attention. But there are 65 controls in the assessment.
Excellent. Sounds very in-depth. I'm excited to take a look at it. I think next question is a good one for you, Garen. Any recommendations around breach councils, incident response companies' use of those? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Listen, it's a tough question for me to answer specifically, right? I think that the circumstances of the incident will dictate, whether a specific IR firm or a specific breach counsel is which one is the best recommendation for your company. I would definitely say that things that you might consider would be familiarity with your environment. I mean, certainly if you have a relationship with an IR firm, saves you a lot of the scoping if they know exactly how many endpoints you have, what tools they're going to need, where to start looking, right? Same thing with breach counsel on the legal side. I also think, depending on what there's a spectrum of attackers out there deploying ransomware. Depending on which one you get, it might pay to work with someone who, tracks that threat, knows how they operate. So there's a lot of nuance that I don't have to answer that question with specificity. But I think that at the time, unfortunately, here's hoping you're not a victim of one of these incidents. But if you are, those are some of the questions I'd be asking, including of those vendors, to make sure that you make a selection that is best for your company.
Good. Let's wrap up with this last question. So many good ones. And by the way, any questions that we didn't get to, the folks here will reach out to you and definitely to help you get your questions answered, as well as folks that are trying out the free ransomware assessment that we've referenced. So last question we want to hit on is, what is a reason to ever pay the data extortion ransom? There's no way to guarantee that the attackers have deleted the data. It's not going to be still used.
So, Garen, I'm just curious, how are you seeing? First of all, are you seeing companies pay the ransom for the exfiltrated data?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, I agree with the question. I don't think there's a good reason to, because there's no guarantee that it's going to be deleted. And have you seen cases where the attackers have come back for a second ransom demand after you've paid the first ransom demand for exfiltrated data?
So I am not specifically aware of an incident where the same attackers had come back and kind of broken their word, if you will. Again, we're talking about the word of a criminal. There is some interesting. I want to give credit where credit's due. Coldware, who's big in the space, recently put out a report that said that in some instances, they had observed that these attackers who had been paid had violated their agreement and actually made some of the sensitive data public in violation of their agreement. I agree with the sentiment. You can't put the data back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't. How are you going to know the data is quote unquote returned? That said, there are certain amounts. Maybe what the attacker is asking for. Maybe the amount might be worth. I'm just trying to give these companies the benefit of the doubt that it might be worth it just from a PR perspective, so that you can get a jump on managing the data, get a firm in place to look at what's being shared on the dark web, or make sure you get your notification out on time and talk with your customers, give them time. But yeah, it is hard to justify, but unfortunately, sometimes happens.
Oh, with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap this up. Folks need to get to their next Zoom call, right? So we thank you, gentlemen, both of you. Excellent conversation, discussion, and demo presentation today. Excited about the assessment. So we'd like to thank everyone for joining us. We do want to announce our 4 gift card winners. Those winners are Eric B., Garrett M., Sarah T., and Shelley Y. The folks here at securityboulevard.com will be reaching out to you to get a hold of those gift cards, maybe pay off some of those Christmas bills that we all have. So again, thanks for sharing with us today, being and spending your time. Thank you to David White, the president of Axio, and Garen Pace, who is cyber product leader at AIG. You know, your time is extremely valuable, and frankly, we're honored that you would spend it with us, and we hope we used it well. Have a good rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Mitch.